about your mom and dad?
My mom and dad came from very diverse backgrounds. My dad grew up in New York City, an area called Washington Heights. Went to George Washington High School, which is well known in New York. He came from an interesting family. The Lustigs originally were from Hungary, from Miskolc and Budapest. And my grandfather, for whom I'm named, Louis Lustig, spent his entire career working for the New York County District Attorney's Office. He was the chief investigator. He was not a lawyer. He was essentially a cop, right?
Right.
Chief investigator. His brother, who was a rather colorful character, William Lustig, my Uncle Billy, who I met only once, was known as Billy the Kid Lustig. And it was written up in a number of books because of some of his nefarious activities. It showed up last in a book by Jimmy Breslin about a biography on Damon Runyon, who, of course, whose stories became the source of Guys and Dolls and the characters that used to hang around Broadway back in the day. And Billy Lustig was one of them. And the only time I ever met him, he was working in a bar on Broadway in Manhattan. And he was a boxer as a young man. He said, "Hey kid, you love to box?" And he kind of put his fists up. And I said, "Sure, Uncle Billy." I was 9 years old. He says, "Come on, let's go meet the champ." So he took me by the hand. We walked across the street to Jack Dempsey's restaurant.
Wow.
Walked in the back, and Dempsey was sitting there with a stack of postcards. And Dempsey looks at me, he says, "Hey kid, do you like to box?" And he puts his fists up. And I said, I really didn't have a great sense of the magnitude of the moment and who Jack Dempsey was.
Wow. Oh, wonderful.
And so that was that was my experience with Uncle Billy. My dad got involved in politics as a young man. Worked for Mayor LaGuardia when he was a young man, and then in 1948 he was part of a campaign team that sent for a neighbor of his in Washington Heights, a young man named Jacob Javits, to the U.S. Senate, and actually was Congress in '48. Senate was in much later. So Javits was a lifelong friend and my dad's. And
what was he like?
My dad?
Well, you're Javits, Jacob Javits. I mean,
I met Javits twice.
Yeah.
Very affable. I met him much later when he was a U.S. Senator. When he was a young congressman, my dad used to escort his wife Marion sometimes around Washington. Javits would ask Dad to help out. He was extremely bright, very spoke very well. Very gregarious kind of guy. And I was a kid, when he was a senator. So you have a very different perspective. I didn't really know the man. Dad introduced me a couple of times.
Well, tell me more about your dad. It's fascinating.
So my dad was a lifelong Republican, but he came out of that progressive Teddy Roosevelt Republican. In fact, they belonged to the Theodore Roosevelt Republican Club in Manhattan. And Dad was just a wonderful guy. We went from Manhattan out to Queens, and he was active in the John Foster Dulles Republican Club, was a New York State committeeman, and I used to go down to the club with him a lot. I was always interested in whatever Dad was interested in. I'm reluctant to share with you that he was a lifelong Yankee fan.
I'll accept that.
And as a kid, I saw Mantle Maris, Yogi Berra, Whitey Ford, all the great Yankees play. We used to go to Yankee Stadium. You could get in there for $3.50 in 1962. And but Dad, and in fact, Dad, they always wanted Dad to run for office, and he was always reluctant to do so. He did not. Dad did not go to school beyond high school, and worked for the Labor Department at one point. But eventually, he went into the furniture business and used to manage furniture stores. But in 1978, they finally convinced Dad to run for the state assembly. Unfortunately, in our district, that meant running against Saul Weprin, who was the Speaker of the New York State Assembly, who was my aunt's candidate. My dad's sister was the longest-serving district leader Democratic district leader in New York State history, 50 years. And so every local politician and, district leaders pick candidates for the state assembly, the state senate, judges. We knew a lot of judges, on both sides of the aisle growing up. So early on, Dad wanted me to go to law school. I decided not to do that coming out of college, where I studied history at Hunter College in New York. And Dad got sick while he was running for the state assembly, and he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer and died in January of 1980. But I think running for office, and of course he couldn't beat Saul Weprin, who, by the way, was a family friend. So I think the election kept him alive for a while. Yeah. He lasted about 18 months, which is a little longer.
Pancreatic cancer,
yeah, so that was tough. Mom came from an interesting family. Her parents were actors in the Yiddish theater. My grandfather, Harry Anisman, was from Kyiv in the Ukraine. My grandmother, Molly, was from Romania. I discovered in the last few years they met in Winnipeg, New York, when they were appearing in a play together up there. And the reason I found that out was my mother gave me a theater poster of my grandmother and my great-grandfather when they appeared in a play together in Pittsburgh. And I used to go to Pittsburgh quite a bit for some of the work that I've been doing. And I had this posters for years, and I said, this is really part of Pittsburgh Jewish history, and I should donate it to the Jewish archives in Pittsburgh. I think like you do, Mr. Peterson. And so they were so thrilled to get this poster. It was the oldest known poster of a theater that no longer exists, called the Landau Theater, and so they did research on my grandparents, and that's how I found out. That's how I found out that they met in Winnipeg. But it was a tough life. My mother lived in 9 cities before she was 17 because they were always on the move. My grandfather, Harry, was one of 9 brothers and sisters, and only he and his brother, Julius, survived the Holocaust. And my uncle, Julius, great-uncle, could not get a visa because of quotas in the United States on Jewish immigration. So he ended up in Caracas, Venezuela, and raised his entire family. He had 4 children. They were all raised in Venezuela. I studied Spanish in high school, thinking someday I'd be able to talk to them. And that portion of the family is all in Israel today, in Tel Aviv and Netanya, because Venezuela is not a good place these days. But growing up, my cousins Juan and Jose used to come to New York all the time because they owned a dress business and they did all their buying in New York. And so I knew them throughout my youth because they came here. But so I have a great movie poster of my great-grandfather. He made a movie in 1933, made several movies in Yiddish. And I saw a poster in a museum that did a retrospective on the Yiddish theater and Yiddish, the Jewish movie business. And saw the poster, recognized his name, went to the American Jewish Historical Society in New York, and they screened his movie for me.
Wow.
So he died before I was born. I never met my grandfather. I knew my grandma Molly, and met, saw what he looked like, what he sounded like, because he was in this movie, and it was the first movie. They would not show it in American theaters because it was 1933, and it was a precursor. It told what was beginning to happen in Europe, and it's the oldest movie that exists. It's called The Wandering Jew in America, that tells of the impending Holocaust. And they thought it was too controversial. American theaters would not show it. And so it's kind of an interesting... So my parents met in New York City. My mother was living in New York as a young woman. She was a teenager. She was 19 when she met my 33-year-old dad. And they were together 32 years before Dad passed away. So I had very loving, wonderful parents. I, of course, was always interested in issues related to the Holocaust, and because of that family history. And, of course, that sparked my interest in the Nuremberg trials, ultimately, as I became interested in law and European history.
So you go to Hunter, after Hunter College, then what?
Well, I've had a very eclectic history. My kids tell me I've lived 9 lives. My first experience out of college was working for the United Jewish Appeal in New York City as a fundraiser in the 5 towns of Long Island. I was a product of B'nai B'rith. It's a Jewish organization that's been around since 1854. At one time was the largest Jewish organization in the world that no longer is. The Anti-Defamation League, Hillel on the college campuses, BBYO high school programs, all came out of B'nai B'rith, and now they're all separate organizations. I was a youth president in the BBYO when I was in high school, and then I became a regional president in New York City, and through college I had studied history and Jewish history and ancient Near East, and did my study abroad at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and so I had a strong connection to the Jewish community. Ironic, given my life over the last 35 years. I was very close to a Jewish history professor of some renown named Robert Seltzer, and we are still friends today, 45 years later.
Yeah.
He wanted me to go to rabbinical school, a place called the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati.
There you go.
And I didn't think, I grew up in a more traditional Jewish experience, so I grew up in a conservative synagogue. I wasn't sure I really wanted to be a Reform rabbi. But, so I worked for UJA, actually didn't like it very much. I said, I don't really want to be a fundraiser. So I moved to Chicago to be a statewide youth director for the B'nai B'rith Youth Organization. In 1976, we had an office in Skokie, Illinois. And in 1977, neo-Nazis said they were going to march in the village of Skokie. I was right in the middle of that.
My God, talk about that. And I remember watching.
I was very much in the middle of that. We came to the office one day, and there was a swastika painted on the side of we had a storefront office.
Oh my God.
On Oakton Avenue in Skokie. Frank Collins, I have intimate knowledge of Skokie in a way that a lot of people don't know. So a group of so-called neo-Nazis that were based in Chicago announced they were going to march in the village of Skokie because Skokie in the mid-70s had the highest concentration of Holocaust survivors in the United States. It's unclear why they were all in Skokie, but the village of Skokie, which billed itself as the world's largest village, had 60,000 residents, north suburb of Chicago, and 40,000 were Holocaust survivors. It was really quite extraordinary. And so these so-called neo-Nazis said they were, Frank Collins had been kicked out of he wasn't even a good Nazi. He was kicked out of the American Nazi Party. But they were going to wear the armbands and the brown shirts and march in Skokie, and the Jewish world went crazy. The Anti-Defamation League, which had a big office in Chicago. There were 250,000 Jews living in the entire city of Chicago. And Abbott Rosen, the head of the ADL, was like in the middle of it. They made a movie about Skokie with Danny Kaye, and Carl Reiner portrayed Abbott Rosen in the movie. I saw Carl Reiner's exhibit yesterday.
Yeah.
And then there was a very militant group from New York City headed by a Orthodox rabbi named Meir Kahana called the Jewish Defense League. And they were going to come in, and they were with clubs and guns, and if the Nazis marched, they were going to beat them up. And so you had the JDL, the ADL. You had the village of Skokie itself, had a non-Jewish mayor named Albert Smith, who came to the defense of his residents and refused to issue a permit for the neo-Nazis to march. A lot of meetings in the Jewish community, what to do about this, how to deal with it. And Frank Collins hired a Jewish attorney. I'm trying to remember his name right now. David, he worked for the ACLU, and he was vilified by the Jewish community for the rest of his career for taking on this case. Goldstein, I'm trying to remember his name. He actually became a professor at Ohio State eventually. And so there were community meetings, and they met a lot in our office of the B'nai B'rith Youth Organization because we were a storefront, and there was a lodge of the B'nai B'rith that used to meet in our offices since we were all part of B'nai B'rith. And so, there'd be late night meetings, and I was working there, so I would sit in and observe all of this. I was 23 years old at the time. And of course, ultimately it became a Supreme Court case. The Nazis won on First Amendment. It was the right decision. But at the time, I couldn't appreciate it because I was a young man, and the legal brief for the residents of Skokie, there were amicus briefs that about the psychological harm of Holocaust survivors seeing Nazis, and it grew in national prominence because Mike Douglas had a daytime show and he put Frank Collins on his show. And,
I forgot he did that.
you know, I mean, I have a knowledge of this that I would just happen to be there in the middle of history.
Forrest Gump.
Forrest Gump. It was my Forrest Gump moment, or my Woody Allen moment.
Now the Supreme Court ruled on it. Did they actually march?
No. What happened was they never marched because the Jewish Defense League said they'd kill them. And they ended up in a march somewhere in a park in downtown Chicago that drew no attention, no, they never marched in Skokie.
The head of the Nazi party at the time, was it
George Lincoln Rockwell.
There we go. Was he still alive at that time? I forget.
I think he was, yeah. Isn't that funny? 50 years ago. You and I have never talked about this.
Never. I'm shocked.
I know. I was right in the middle of that. And then I met a rabbi. Like I said, I've had 9 lives. I met an Orthodox rabbi. I had been moving towards a more traditional Judaism at that time. I met an Orthodox rabbi named Don Well. There was a major Orthodox seminary in Chicago called the Hebrew Theological College, and he was encouraging me to come to school there. And so I sat in some classes and ultimately became a seminary student at the Hebrew Theological College. I did pastoral counseling training at Rush Hospital in Chicago, and I joined the Navy and was a Naval Reserve officer. I was in the chaplain candidate program. It was my first real interfaith experience at the Great Lakes Naval Base and the Glenview Naval Air Station. Mm-hmm. But then as I moved through my 20s and I realized I really wasn't comfortable as an Orthodox Jew, and I probably wouldn't make a very good Orthodox rabbi. I had a good friend of mine who followed me at the B'nai B'rith Youth Organization, a fellow named Steve Kane. He was going out to school in California at a place called the University of Judaism, and he wanted me to join him out there. And I said, no, I'm 28 now. I can't keep going to school. I really have to, work again. And he's been a rabbi for many years in Westchester County in New York. And I went to work for B'nai B'rith International. It was a logical move. I knew the national director of B'nai B'rith. During those years, I had also been working at the B'nai B'rith had camps in Pennsylvania, Starlight, Pennsylvania, in Wayne County, and I had worked there for several years. I did a lot of Jewish programming for the campers, and I worked on the waterfront when I was young and skinny, and I was a good swimmer. I swam in college. And then they sent me out to Wisconsin with a group of staff in '77 to start a camp out there for B'nai B'rith in Mukwonago that'll celebrate its 50th anniversary in a couple of years. And I still have close ties to Bieber Camp. And so I went to work for B'nai B'rith, oddly enough, as a fundraiser. I returned to fundraising and we had an office in New York that used to run fundraising dinners. And that's all we did. We ran big corporate dinners in New York and Chicago and Louisville and Denver, all over the place. Met some extraordinary people, corporate executives, CEOs I never would have met who were the honorees at the dinners. The biggest dinner I ever ran was in 1986 for Ambassador Walter Annenberg. And I got to Annenberg. It's an extraordinary story because I had started a healthcare dinner, sparked my interest in healthcare in 1983. We honored the chairman of the Hospital Corporation of America. I started the first healthcare dinner ever done by an organization at a national level. And I got this idea in my head: if you honored the biggest hospital provider, all the suppliers would buy tables to the dinner because they do business, right? So we were able to make a connection to a fellow named Donald S. McNaughton Jr. He'd been the president of Prudential, and then he was brought in by the Frist family in Nashville, Tennessee, to run the Hospital Corporation of America before young Dr. Thomas Frist, whose brother was a U.S. Senator, could take over the company. So McNaughton agreed to do the dinner. It was, I'll never forget, he was about 6'7", and he was on the board of Exxon, and he asked me, I was in my late 20s, he asked me to meet him there. And I met him in the boardroom of Exxon. I was totally intimidated. I remember I was so nervous. I was shaking in my boots. I was physically shaking, trying to talk to him about doing this dinner. And he was such a wonderful guy. He did everything he could to calm me down. And it was a great dinner. The dinner chair was the then president or CEO of Prudential Insurance, but I learned about. I didn't know anything about healthcare. I didn't know who the suppliers were. There was no internet. There was no, all we had was directories, books, and magazines. So I scoured Hospitals Magazine, Modern Healthcare Magazine, and the publisher Modern Healthcare wanted to have it play a prominent role in the dinner. And a fellow named Chuck Lowell, and he came to an organizational meeting we had at the 21 Club in New York. And first words he ever said to me were, "You son of a bitch, I don't know how you pulled this off, but if you'll give Modern Healthcare a prominent role in the dinner, I'll teach you everything you need to know about healthcare." And fabulous dinner at Waldorf Astoria in New York, and Chuck Lowell became a lifelong friend. But his Modern Healthcare was owned by Crane Communications in Chicago. And Rance Crane used to come to the dinner, who was the CEO of the company. It was a family-owned business. And so I got to know Rance Crane really well, and their premier publication was Advertising Age, the Bible of the advertising. Yeah. So I asked Rance Crane if he'd get me an honoree for a dinner in the advertising industry. And he looked at me and he says, "Well, how about Walter Annenberg?" And I said, "Walter Annenberg," I said, he was an advertiser, not from the agency. He owned TV Guide and I don't know how many newspapers, Philadelphia Inquirer, TV stations, right? Plus, he was ambassador of the Court of St. James under Nixon. And I said, "That's much bigger than an advertising dinner." So we got Walter Annenberg, and I said to the president of B'nai B'rith, "This is not an advertising dinner. What's our highest award?" And he says, "Well, we give out an award called the Presidential Gold Medallion. It only goes to special people." But everybody recognized Annenberg was a big deal, and So they agreed to do that, and then we had to find a dinner chair, and Annenberg had sold a bunch of TV stations to somebody named Tom Murphy. Thomas Murphy, who was the CEO of Capital Cities out of Albany, New York, Capital Cities, and they bought ABC Television. So Tom Murphy gave us a whole production crew from ABC to put on the dinner. We always talk about dinners, right? Well, this is the biggest one I ever ran. And so Barbara Walters was the MC for the dinner. It was fabulous. Annenberg was close to U.S. presidents. We had three, Gerald Ford, and Ronald Reagan as honorary chairs of the dinner. Ronald Reagan was president in those years, and ABC got Reagan to do a video toast, sitting U.S. president. And so at one point, Barbara Walters says to the 1,400 people assembled, we now have a toast from a special friend, of Walters, and the curtains opened, and the video showed Ronald Reagan holding a glass of champagne. Hope you'll all join me in a toast to my good friend. But the biggest coup of the night wasn't the President of the United States. Walter Annenberg lived next door to Frank Sinatra in Palm Springs. And we wanted to get Frank Sinatra to sing at the dinner. And he agreed to sing for free, but it required a 32-piece orchestra. And we couldn't afford the orchestra. It was a fundraising dinner, right? But he agreed to attend the dinner. And I got to tell you, when Frank Sinatra walked in the room, it was like nothing I've ever experienced. And we sold seats for Sinatra's table. You had to pay $25,000 to sit at Sinatra's table. Wow. And Sam Lefkowitz, who was a cousin to the former New York State Attorney General Louis Lefkowitz, who was a friend of my grandfather's. They used to play pinochle together. Sam said to me, Sinatra drinks Jack Daniels. So I sent a bottle of Jack Daniels over. It's the first, so that's my claim to fame. I bought Frank Sinatra a drink. And he was an older man by then. We had a great time. So I did 100 dinners from 1982 to 1987. And then because of the healthcare dinner, it sparked my interest in healthcare. One of the dinners we did was for a fellow named Leslie Wexner, the Limited, Columbus, Ohio. And my boss at that time, a rabbi named Maurice Corson, became close to Les Wexner. He moved to Columbus to become the president of the Wexner Foundation. And 2 years later, he called me and he said, Les, I know you're interested in healthcare from that healthcare dinner you started. Would you consider moving to Columbus, Ohio? We need somebody to raise money for the Wexner Institute for Pediatric Research. So I moved to Columbus, and I met Elaine. She was the chief tech in neurology. Had a team of EEG techs that did, brainwave testing. And it's good to have somebody at home that can check your brainwaves. Yeah. And Elaine and I got married 11 months to the day of our first date. Wow. We met, the first date was December 26, 1987. We got married November 26, 1988, and both daughters were born in Columbus, Melanie and Eliana. And the chief of legal services at the Nationwide Children's Hospital and I were really close friends in those years. a fellow named Mitch Melfi, and he said, he said, you love this law, because he'd hear me talking about law stuff all the time. He says, why don't you go, there's a law school in Columbus called Capital University that has a night program. Why don't you consider, going back to law school? You're not traveling, all the fundraising is local. So at 28, I said I was never going to go back to school, and at 38, I went to law school. 4 years at night at Capital, but I left the Children's Hospital, became a statewide development director for the American Lung Association. Met a lot of pulmonologists back at that time. And they said to me, there was a group from the Lung Association said, we want to start an organization nobody knows about sleep medicine. And sleep apnea is a huge issue. And nobody knows what a CPAP machine is. Now they got commercials on TV. We need somebody to kind of lead our efforts to create the American Sleep Apnea Association. So that kind of, so I became their first executive director, decided I thought I was going to go into healthcare law, and moved away from law practice and the idea of law practice, and became the first executive director of the American Sleep Apnea Association. But we thought at that time that we were going to remain in Ohio and sleep apnea. I have some great stories from that time. My favorite, I consider it the greatest failure of my career. I met a neurologist out of Minnesota that got the license for an item that was like a Band-Aid. It had a little metal strip running through it, and you put it on your nose, it flares your nostrils. It's called Breathe Right. Mm-hmm. And he said to me, if you can get the board of the American Sleep Apnea Association to kind of put their name on the box, if you will, like all these American Heart and Lung, they all, you see on a box of Cheerios, American Heart Association. He said, I'll give you 2 cents for every one of these I sell. They cost me a nickel. I'm going to sell them for 50 cents a piece. I had a board full of doctors that said, no, if we do, people are going to think that's a cure for sleep apnea. I said, no, you still have to wear your CPAP. Well, Dan Cohen, who was the head of Breathe Right, became a gazillionaire. The organization would have gotten hundreds of thousands of dollars. I couldn't convince them to do it. They said no. I was a little disenchanted with the board, and they wanted to move the organization to Washington. I got a call from a recruiter about becoming the director of development for the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. I said, Hebrew Union College? My life was, right? Because I was now in my 40s, 20 years earlier. They wanted me to go to school there. My professor wanted me to go to school there. And I spent 7 wonderful years at the Hebrew Union College. And I was recruited by Syracuse. They wanted to build a Hillel building at Syracuse University. They didn't know how to navigate the national Jewish community, which I had learned through my years in B'nai B'rith and through HUC. And ironically, I loved working for Hebrew Union, and we liked Cincinnati. Elaine was reluctant to move to Syracuse. And we got to Syracuse. We were there 3 weeks, and Elaine said, when are you taking me home? I can't deal with this snow. And we stayed there 15 years. So we built one of the most beautiful Hillel buildings in the country. And I had my choice of assignments at Syracuse University, and there was a new dean coming to the law school at Syracuse, and I could either head a team of regional major gift officers or become an associate dean for advancement at the law school. And I said, you know, I really valued my law school education. I think being part of the dean's leadership team would be a wonderful experience. And so we were getting. So when I went over to the law school, one of the first things I saw, there was 2 buildings. It was one of the halls was called McNaughton Hall. So I went to the new dean hadn't started yet. I went to the old dean. I said, "Who's McNaughton?" It couldn't be Donald McNaughton. He says, "Yeah, Donald S. McNaughton Jr., the former chairman of the Hospital Corporation of America, went to Syracuse Law School." And I said, "You got to be kidding me." I said, "You know, that was 30 years ago." I said, "Where is he still alive?" And he says, "I hate to tell you this, Lowell, but he passed away last week."
Yeah.
And so I represented the university at a memorial service with the dean of the law school at the Prudential Building in Newark, New Jersey, and saw a lot of the folks that I met at the healthcare dinner in 1983. And then his son also went to Syracuse, who was a partner with White and Case in New York. And I got his son I created a new advisory board. We tore down a board and built it back up. That experience has informed every board experience I've ever had ever since. The dean and I literally, we had a group we put together a strategic planning committee led by a Shearman and Sterling partner named Robert Deneen. His father was a New York State Insurance Commissioner at one point, Bob Deneen Sr. And we tore down a board with the help of this group of lawyers on this planning committee and built it back up. And I got Don McNaughton Jr. to be in that group, along with some of the best board people I've ever worked with. I had a lot of discussions with various directors of the Robert H. Jackson Center about board development along the way and tear it down. But of course the law school was a wonderful place for me. And I met a professor named David Crane, and he knew of my great interest in the Nuremberg trials. And we became, I'll never forget the first time I met David. It was at a dinner, and everyone was very enamored. He was a new professor there. We were fascinated by what he had done in Sierra Leone. And I remember looking at David Crane and I said to him, this was a country that was devastated. No health care, no sanitation, no education for kids. Why would anybody care about a war crime trial? And I'll never forget what David said to me. He said, you know, Lowell, he said, at the end of the day, everybody wants to know there's justice in the world. And I was so taken with that. And then I was at the law school for, 4 to 5 years, and a law school alum named Bill Brodsky, who was the chairman of the Chicago Board of Options, was the president of the Hillel board at Syracuse. And the Hillel were struggling financially. And he said, Lowell, he said, I know you love the law school. Bill, by the way, we had a class of 68. He had a classmate named Joe Biden who remained very close. Joe Biden actually did a video when we were honoring Bill Brodsky at a dinner at Syracuse, a law review dinner. And Joe Biden said in that video, he said, you know, the only election I ever lost was for the first year class president to Bill Brodsky. And during my years at the law school, Joe Biden came 3 times to speak at 2 law school graduation and 1 university graduation. I was his handler. I had to make sure that, from the moment he arrived until he left, that he was taken care of. I got to chat with him. I'm not sure he always remembered my name, because every time he'd see me, he'd say, "Hey," he'd look at me like this, "Hey man, how you doing?" But he used to walk around the law school, talk to all the staff, go see his professors. We'd talk to all the administrative staff, ask them about their families. And when he spoke at graduation, he would shake hands with every law student, have a little something to say to each one. I was so impressed with whatever your political leanings as a human being. I think he had been through so much in his life. He was a very gracious, charismatic, more than I think comes through on TV, and spoke extremely well at these graduation ceremonies. So I sort of am Forrest Gump. I didn't even tell you all the... I tell you one other funny story from the dinner time. I did a dinner once for Donald Peterson, who was the chairman and CEO of the Ford Motor Company, in between Fords. And I flew to Detroit to meet with him about the dinner, and I purposely rented a car from Hertz, because Hertz was partially Ford owned in those years. And wouldn't you know, the only car they had on the lot was a Toyota Corolla. And I drove to Ford Motor Company in a Toyota, and the first thing I told Peterson, I said, "This is just too funny not to tell him." I said, "I can't tell you what I went through trying to drive here in a Ford." He got a big kick out of it.
Yeah.
So, I was asked to, Brodsky asked me to go to Hillel. And I said I'd do it for a year or 2, because it's going to derail my advancement career if I stay at Hillel any longer. And I loved so much working with the students, I stayed there 5 years. And so Crane, I said to Crane, I said, I would love to get a Nuremberg prosecutor. By the way, the one thing I forgot to tell you is, in my years working for the Hebrew Union College, I used to do dinners in St. Louis.
Yeah.
And I did one dinner for, I can't believe, as soon as Bill Danforth, who was the president of Washington University, former chairman of their board, former dean of the medical school, and a fellow named Whitney Harris came to that dinner. And I got to know Whitney Harris because of the dinner. He invited me to his home, gave me a copy of his book, Tyranny on Trial, inscribed it for me. Extraordinary person. Loved meeting him. And so that of course enhanced my interest in Nuremberg. And I said to David, I said, I would love to get somebody here at Syracuse. We could start with a session in the morning with the Jewish community, have them do a master class with law students. And then we had something called the University Lecture Series, which was the biggest lecture series. And he says, we do these interviews. There's this great fellow named Greg Peterson at the Jackson Center, and he'd begun to tell me about the Robert H. Jackson Center. He says, I think we can get Henry King because of my association with Case Western. And we brought, and he said we did, and Greg could interview Henry King as a program, and of course that was a fabulous day.
I remember that very well, by the way.
I almost can't talk about that day without getting tears in my eyes, because I don't know how well you remember the night. I mean, we had a full house for Henry King. And in the morning, I don't know if you were at the breakfast in the morning that we had for the Jewish community, but he talked about his first-hand conversations with Albert Speer. And it was like, it was so chilling, because he would talk about Speer talking about Hitler, and I remember it the rest of my life. And then I don't know if you remember that night, which was one of the most extraordinary evenings I've ever had. Henry King started crying because I can't believe I'm getting teary-eyed here. Henry King started crying because he couldn't, and he looked at me and he said, "Why are they all standing?" And I looked at him and I said, "Mr. King, they're all standing because the world's a better place for what you did."
No, it was very meaningful, yeah.
So, you know, we had that great event, and then I wanted to find a way to, when I decided to, then we talked about doing the dinner with Ben Ferenz in New York City, and Bill Brodsky, who, oh, that's how you know who Bill Brodsky is. I asked Bill to be the chair of that dinner.
Right.
And he, you know, that was a great event, and I wanted to use it to highlight the Jackson Center. Since because of you and David, we were able to get Ben Ferenz. Look at this. I'm still teary-eyed from Henry King. And Ben, needless to say, getting to know Ben Ferenz a little was extraordinary. What an extraordinary human being. You know, so as you can tell, I care very deeply about this stuff. And everyone in the room that night was mesmerized. And it was, you know, and I'm glad you could be there, and David, and we talked a little about the Jackson Center, and it was at that point that I remember you and Stan Lundeen, and you guys came over and asked me if I would be willing to serve on the Jackson Center board. One of the great privileges of my life.
So as you got on the board, I think you were on for like 8 years.
9 years.
9 years. And still active through the committees.
Yeah.
What's your sense of Jackson, first of all? Because you probably didn't study him much at all.
Correct.
Other than as being part of the Nuremberg trial, which that was sort of bigger than this.
Well, the irony is that I'm studying Jackson now.
Yeah.
I went back to graduate school to get a master's degree in social sciences. And when I started this program, I thought I was going to study more American history related. And I ended up taking a class in international law, human rights, law and justice, violence and peace. I am now at this stage of my life in an academic setting, reading. We actually just 3 weeks ago we had a module on the Nuremberg trials and then the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem, which was very controversial. When I first came to the Jackson Center, I actually understand Jackson better now than I did when I first came on the board. because I have now read more of his court cases. More of the Nuremberg trials were controversial at the time and remain so. Just from what the place of the Nuremberg trials are in modern international law, and I have classmates that struggled. They felt that the Nuremberg trials were a function of victor's justice, which is a common claim. Of course, that can be dispelled in a number of ways. But I mean, the trials were not were imperfect, but nevertheless a monument to justice in the world. But when I came on board, in answering your question, I had always been I was always a court watcher. I was always interested in presidential history and in court history. So but I only knew Jackson peripherally. But I was aware of his dissent in Korematsu, having gone to law school. I was aware of the West Virginia case, having gone to law school. I was aware of Brown because of law school. But I did not fully appreciate Robert Jackson as a visionary, as a force on the court, as his gift as a writer, So I of course, because of my interest in Nuremberg, I knew of his role at Nuremberg, but did not fully appreciate his import in American history, in international law, until I got involved with the Jackson Center.
I remember seeing you for the very first time. We talked about this even last night at an international humanitarian law dialogue.
Right.
At Chautauqua.
Right.
I remember you sitting in a wicker chair, and
David Crane invited me. Right.
Yeah, and I was just kind of like, you wonder who he is, because you kind of knew it's a small community, so you kind of know everybody. And there you were, with
and you do know everybody.
And so all of a sudden, but I didn't know you. So of course that led to getting the chance to meet you and understand, which then led to everything else that you just talked about. But did David kind of say, hey, you might enjoy hanging around, or did you just sort of ab initio?
No, he asked me to come to the dialogues.
Okay.
He wanted, he thought he knew of my interest. He said, you'll meet, when I was there, Ben Ferenz was there. I met Bill Kaming, who was also at Nuremberg. Michael Scharf was there. I just got finished reading in graduate school a chapter that Michael Scharf wrote about Robert Jackson in the book, The Founders.
Right, yeah.
Right. So we've actually been studying that book. I mean, it's so ironic that, so I got to meet Scharf there, and I'm trying to think who else was there. Well, we just finished another section on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, and just finished reading an analysis of that experience by Goldstone.
Yeah.
And he was there. Lila Sadat was there. I mean, this was a who's who.
No question.
And and of course the dialogues are now part of Case Western.
Right.
I almost went to work for Case Western at one point.
Really?
They were looking for an assistant dean for advancement at the law school, and but they hired somebody internally. But I had a brief conversation with Michael Scharf about it. So there you go. So I have, I served 9 years on the board. I think it's good for boards to have turnover, having been someone that has created boards and trained boards. I also said to our current president at one point, I said, I think I bring certain things to the board, but I would probably not serve on a board that had me as a member, because you need individuals that bring significant resources. That I work in a certain corner of the world, and you need a number of individuals on this board that can raise its profile in ways that I don't think I can. And yet, I don't know, maybe I'm selling myself short, because we're about to talk about how we can do a dinner for the Robert H. Jackson Center. You probably don't even know this. But I'm preparing an entire briefing for the board on how dinners are done.
Terrific.
And we've always dabbled in this, and we've talked about it from a distance. But if we can do a dinner for a small hillel in Syracuse, New York, we won't go into that now, but so, they asked me to continue on the development committee, and I had always hoped that the Robert H. Jackson Center would transcend Western New York. And there are ways to do that, and we're not there yet. But I think there are ways to do that, because the import of Robert Jackson far transcends Frewsburg and Jamestown and even Washington, D.C.
Yeah, and I could agree with you more, just simply because we have some name recognition in Europe. It's interesting, certainly.
Well, of course you do.
Germany and in England and stuff.
And Germany's a very different country today, right?
Name recognition regionally.
And in Israel.
Yeah, and Israel as well. So it's that you're dead on. To get us out of this, to expand beyond this. Right now, we've gone from no name to quite a name in our Western New York area, from even having a courthouse named after Jackson, the federal courthouse. But which you're driving and striving for is precisely dead on, and you're the man. I mean, just think about what you just said here about the number of dinners and opportunities, because that's planning, man. That's planning 101.
It's planning. It's setting it up correctly. It's having the right honoree. It's the right dinner chair, right dinner committee. And there's a number of different ways to do it. I'm not sure this should be part of our film,
We can talk about that.
We can talk about that.
Okay. As you look back, Lowell, just to kind of some sort of wrap on this, in your time at the Jackson Center, not only you're as board, but also you attended events during those time periods.
Yes.
Any kind of one or two sort of a legacy moments for you where you said, I remember
sure.
such and such?
Well, certainly the visit of Chief Justice Roberts. The fact that the current court holds Jackson in such reverence and will always hold him in reverence. I don't think Robert H. Jackson will ever go out of style. Mm-hmm. And I think there are other Supreme Court justices. I mean, most people cannot name the 9 justices sitting on the Supreme Court. But I think that for generations to come, every member who comes to that court will, and I think because of his legacy, he will transcend in popular imagination beyond the court other justices who've sort of fallen by the wayside in terms of their importance beyond their legal decisions. But certainly John Roberts' visit, the impact it had on this community, The fact that other justices come here when they come to this part of the world to pay tribute. I think, that certainly was, it has nothing to do with what side of the aisle they're on, or their legal strategies, or their how they view the judicial process. A Chief Justice is a Chief Justice.
Right.
So that certainly is a highlight. I think I've also attended, I was here when Bob Woodward was interviewed by Mark Russell, who's been a great friend to the Jackson Center. Woodward has his own place in American history. I think the fact that we continue to attract people of this caliber speaks volumes about the importance of this place. And we need a Jackson Center.
And we're glad to have had a Lowell Lustig as part of it and continuing to be part of it. So thank you very much.
You even got me teary-eyed.